Spotify is removing Neil Young's catalog of music after the artist posed an open letter with an ultimatum: deal with the vaccine misinformation coming from Joe Rogan's podcast or lose Young's music.
Hello and welcome to the Nexus. The Joe Rogan-Neil Young dispute over COVID vaccines is still raging more than a week after it all kicked off online. In the red corner, we have Joe Rogan, arguably the world's top podcaster. And in the blue corner, Neil Young, a rock and folk legend from the 60s and 70s. Young, who contracted polio as a child back in the early 50s, supports COVID vaccines for pretty much everyone. Rogan, on the other hand, says the young and healthy probably don't need them. Both men sell their work on Spotify, or did anyway, and make good money on the platform. However, last week, Neil Young gave Spotify an ultimatum. It's either him or me. Spotify chose the bald and brash podcaster, but it's not over. In fact, the war of words has only just begun.
And now to an upheaval in music streaming. Legendary singer-songwriter Neil Young is pulling his music from Spotify because the streaming service continues to give a platform to podcaster Joe Rogan, who has been accused of spreading misinformation about COVID.
It's a completely new kind of vaccine. The idea that people shouldn't be skeptical or nervous about that is kind of hilarious.
Neil Young gave the streaming service an ultimatum. They can have Rogan or Young, not both. He said, "I'm doing this because Spotify is spreading fake information about vaccines, potentially causing death to those who believe the disinformation being spread by them."
Spotify has spoken and it has chosen Joe Rogan over Neil Young.
Rogan has an average of 11 million listeners and a reported $100 million contract.
Rogan has become an American institution.
This is one of their biggest, most profitable entities, and so the idea they were going to side with Neil Young over this was crazy.
Rogan hosts a range of medical experts on his podcast and assures he's not anti-vax. Still, he has appeared to discourage young people from getting the jab.
I don't think that if you're a young, healthy person, that you need it.
He just says he's having a conversation. That's what Joe Rogan will say.
Yeah, but it's a life or death issue. That's why it's in a special category.
Lately, it's just kind of devolved into like one weird COVID conspiracy theorist after the next.
I'm not trying to promote misinformation. I'm not trying to be controversial. I've never tried to do anything with this podcast other than just talk to people and have interesting conversations.
Rogan made Spotify a podcast platform. Getting the Rogan deal was huge for them.
I think the big picture here is whether other artists follow Neil Young, and then it could become a business problem for Spotify.
The singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell has said she'll remove her music in solidarity with Neil Young.
Spotify is responding tonight to a boycott of its streaming platform.
Spotify says it's going to add a content advisory to any podcast episode discussing COVID-19, directing people to expert information on the virus.
Sure, have that on there. I'm very happy with that. My point of doing this is always just to create interesting conversations and ones that I hope people enjoy. So if I'm sorry, and if you enjoy the podcast, thank you.
Now, at this point, you may be thinking they're both talented in their own way, but who cares what either of them think about COVID vaccines? Neither of them are doctors, after all. But what's important is how they influence millions of people in America and beyond. As they step onto the cultural battlefield, who has the greater firepower? Let's start with Neil Young. The Canadian-American's been making music for nigh on 60 years now and is justifiably regarded as a rock and folk legend. He's written and recorded dozens of beautiful and moving songs over the years, but he's probably best known for Heart of Gold.
I wanna live, I wanna give. I've been a miner for a heart of gold.
Remarkably, this 1971 release is Young's only #1. Although Rockin' in the Free World, released nearly 20 years later, would reach #2 in the charts. The other thing you need to know about Neil Young is that he was, for a while, the fourth member of folk rock supergroup Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And he's considered one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Rolling Stone put him at #17, a bit high, but ahead of Carlos Santana, James Burton, and even Les Paul. Now let's switch to Joe Rogan. He's been a stand-up comedian.
Look, I got it on tape. We can make copies. 10, 15 bucks a pop for these. What? I got blank tapes in my van. We'll bang it out over lunch.
UFC commentator. And in 2009, he found his real calling with podcasts.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Interviewing everyone from Mike Tyson to the eminent psychologist Jordan Peterson, and over the past decade, he's built up a vast following. That's what attracted Spotify, which in 2020 reportedly signed him in an exclusive deal worth over $100 million. And in return, he pulls in about 11 million listeners per episode. It's a sweet deal for Rogan, but in stark contrast, Neil Young's been fed up with Spotify for a very long time. He pulled most of his music off the platform several years ago, complaining the sound quality on the service was too low. He then put his songs back on Spotify because it was just too popular to ignore. Then, on Monday last week, he pulled the plug once and for all. In an open letter to his management team, published on his website, Young wrote, "I am doing this because Spotify is spreading false information about vaccines. They can have Rogan or Young, not both." Spotify went Rogan, quickly started taking down the music of Neil Young. Now, Young must have known it was a gamble, but said he had to do something after reading about how 200+ doctors had written their own open letter to Spotify, warning the platform about Joe Rogan. Not all of the authors were doctors, though. Some were dentists, physiotherapists, and even a vet. And they wrote that throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, Joe Rogan has repeatedly spread misleading and false claims on his podcast, provoking distrust in science and medicine. Their biggest complaint was that he'd interviewed Dr. Robert Malone, who they'd accused of promoting baseless conspiracy theories. The letter says that Malone was unfit to be a guest because he was suspended from Twitter for spreading misinformation about COVID-19 and for comparing pandemic policies to the Holocaust.
We're going to tell you how to think, okay? People kind of got to get that in their head. That's the world we're in right now.
In Rogan's first response to Young and the doctors, he defended his right to interview Dr. Malone.
Dr. Robert Malone owns 9 patents on the creation of mRNA vaccine technology and is at least partially responsible for the creation of the technology that led to mRNA vaccines. Both these people are very highly credentialed, very intelligent, very accomplished people, and they have an opinion that's different from the mainstream narrative. I wanted to hear what their opinion is.
Now, Rogan will continue to interview controversial voices, but that's not to say that Neil Young has failed to change anything. For example, Spotify has agreed to add a content advisory to any podcast episode that includes a discussion about COVID-19. This advisory will direct listeners to their dedicated COVID-19 hub, a resource that provides easy access to data-driven facts, up-to-date information, as shared by scientists, physicians, academics, and public health authorities around the world, as well as links to trusted sources. This new effort to combat misinformation will roll out to countries around the world in the coming days, they say. And as for Joe Rogan, well, he's promised to make some changes too.
I think if there's anything that I've done that I could do better is have more experts with differing opinions right after I have the controversial ones. I would most certainly be open to doing that. And I would like to talk to some people that have differing opinions on those podcasts in the future. We'll see. I'm not mad at Neil Young. I'm a huge Neil Young fan. I've always been a Neil Young fan. Keep on rocking in a free world.
Let's bring in our guest now. And Alan Cross is a music writer and host of a radio show called Ongoing History of New Music. Dean Crutchfield is the CEO of a marketing consultancy firm with one foot in America and another one in Britain. And then for the medical perspective, we have Dr. Anthony Hinton, a former NHS surgeon for over 30 years, and finally Professor William Schaffner, a professor of infectious diseases at Vanderbilt University. Professor Schaffner, welcome back to the Nexus. You've actually been on the Joe Rogan show, and I hear you found the interaction with him rather difficult. Why was that?
Well, Matthew, it was civil, but it was difficult. You know, I'm an explainer. I try to use the media as a way of educating the public. And Joe Rogan just keeps interrupting. He doesn't let you get to that third sentence in trying to explain something. So it's very difficult to have a conversation. I think having a conversation about differences of opinion is very educational, but you have to respect the other person and let them say a few sentences in order to get their position out. And it was rather difficult with him.
I noticed that some in the media and online have implied that he has bad intentions. I mean, do you think he has bad intentions, or do you think he's just misinformed?
I think in part he's misinformed. He is attracted to unconventional points of view, but of course he's also an entertainer rather than an educator. And this kind of tumult on his program, people having a brisk discussion and his making the mainstream fellow look a bit like a doofus, I think is good for his ratings.
The Neil Young and the letter from the doctors and others were complaining about a number of specific things he'd said. Which did you find the most egregious?
Well, when we were discussing things, he would bring up a series of individual studies, which he had not alerted me to, so I was not completely comfortable with them. And he deals a lot in half-truths, for example, about masks and their utility. And as you're starting to make your explanation, he will then interrupt you and not permit you to provide a complete story, which makes it very difficult to explain and to educate his listeners.
Dr. Hinton, from previous appearances on this program, I get the feeling you probably have some sympathy for Joe Rogan's approach to trying to explain the various aspects of this pandemic to his listeners and viewers. What's your opinion of his program?
Well, I think really what we need is open debate. And one-on-one interviews can be useful, but actually I prefer this format, where you've got two different doctors with maybe slightly different views, and you can explore those differences. And they can both actually ask each other questions and come to some sort of consensus. The problem is throughout this pandemic is that always one side has been very highly censored. And things that we would have said 8 months ago and been thrown off Twitter are now becoming the mainstream. So, for instance, 8 months ago, if you'd have said natural immunity, having caught COVID, is at least as good as vaccine immunity, that would have got you thrown off. But I think now that's something that's pretty well accepted, with a very big study that's recently come out from the CDC of cases in California and New York.
Dr. Hinton, very interesting you should make that point. Joe Rogan made a similar point when he was defending himself after the Neil Young letter. Let's have a listen.
The problem I have with the term misinformation, especially today, is that many of the things that we thought of as misinformation just a short while ago are now accepted as fact. Like, for instance, 8 months ago, if you said, if you get vaccinated, you can still catch COVID and you can still spread COVID, you would be removed from social media. They would ban you from certain platforms. Now, that's accepted as fact. If you said, I don't think cloth masks work, you would be banned from social media. Now, that's openly and repeatedly stated on CNN. If you said, I think it's possible that COVID-19 came from a lab, you'd be banned from many social media platforms. Now, that's on the cover of Newsweek.
So, Professor Schaffner, what Joe Rogan is saying there is that things are merely conspiracy theories until a few months later they're proven to be true. What do you make of that?
Well, of course, as we get new information, then new things happen. Back then, when that was said, we didn't have Delta and we certainly didn't have Omicron. Those variants have changed the equation. And you have to acknowledge that it's the science that changes, and therefore the public policy and the conclusions you draw from the science can change. And I think the mainstream folks have said, you've got to stay tuned constantly because we will change what we're saying depending upon the changing circumstances. And if you just acknowledge that, then a lot of the steam goes out of those assertions.
Yeah, were there any other points that he made in that soundbite there where he was, purveying misinformation again?
Well, it's not so much misinformation, but apropos of the origin of the virus, I think the vast majority of virologists and public health people believe it is a natural phenomenon, a a coronavirus that jumped species. Could it have originated in the laboratory? Yes. Is that the likely explanation? No.
Can I ask you both about Dr. Robert Malone? Professor Schaffner first. Is he a worthy guest to have on such a big platform?
Well, I'm not personally familiar with Dr. Malone, and sure, Joe Rogan can have whomever he wants on his show. As I listened to his concepts, I certainly didn't agree with them, but of course, dialogue is of interest and reasonable.
The argument is that he makes claims that are unfounded and exaggerated, for example, about how societal leaders have hypnotized people into doing what they want under the guise of protecting them from COVID. So the question is under free speech, should he be allowed to appear on Joe Rogan, or is he a danger to the typical listener of Joe Rogan, who apparently is around 24 years of age?
Well, I would certainly think that under free speech, he certainly ought to be allowed to promote his ideas, which I find rather extraordinary and don't conform with reality. Now, if Joe Rogan wishes to do a service and educate his viewers, he would have more mainstream people on to explain that also.
Okay, so if you were on, what would you, in particular, what is the main point you'd pick up on with Dr. Robert Malone?
My notion is that there's no hypnotism going on out there, that the conventional public health and infectious disease doctors are providing good, solid information. And if you give them the opportunity to actually put a paragraph together, they can explain why the current policy is what it is.
Dr. Hinton, your take on Robert Malone. Is he worthy of such a big platform, and do you find him credible?
Well, Robert Malone has about 8 or 9 patents to do with mRNA vaccines. He didn't invent this particular mRNA vaccine, but he did a lot of the preliminary work many years ago. So he does know a lot about this, and that's how he's come to prominence. He's also a person that himself has taken COVID vaccines. And I think he also had a very bad bout of COVID before that. So he's not really an anti-vax person. He's somebody whose views have changed as the science has become more clear. And we have to learn to what happens as things change. And we were talking earlier about, the professor was talking about Delta changed things and Omicron had changed things. And I absolutely agree with that. And I would hope we would all agree that Omicron is changing things very much for the better. And in fact, I would say going forward, Omicron is the vaccine that we've been waiting for.
Let us turn to the cultural debate now. We're running out of time. Dean and Alan, I'd like to bring you in at this point. We're going to talk about Spotify in a moment. I just want to talk, first of all, about these two men. Who has the greater cultural and commercial power right now? Dean Crutchfield.
Joe Rogan.
Why?
Well, because he's of the moment. I think Neil Young and Joni Mitchell have done a spectacular job raising the alarm to this. Let's not lose, sight of the real facts here. Over 850,000 people have perished because of COVID, and we have to stop this rampant, misinformation that's going on out in the place. But Rogan's extremely popular. He's had 200 million downloads since this debacle hit the news. So in terms of cultural appropriateness for the audience of Gen Zs and millennials, he would have more power. That's my personal opinion.
All right. And Alan?
I would agree. It's Joe Rogan. Neil Young is a man that has been very principled for 50 or 60 years in terms of his career. But as a cultural force today, he pales in comparison to what Joe can command. I mean, 11 to 14 million downloads twice a week. That's a lot of cultural power. And the people that he has listening to him, people under the age of 25, who are gravitated to him because he was a comedian, because he was on a TV show called Fear Factor, because he was an MMA expert, are looking for validation for the way they feel about the pandemic, and they're fighting it with him. And that is sending these ripples across society.
And Neil Young, he's getting reinforcements from Joni Mitchell and from a few other pop stars. Do you think that that is going to gather pace and that actually Neil Young is going to win round 2 here?
Well, I was very wrong when I thought that this would be a 24-hour story and it would just fade away. What's happened is that Neil Young has become a lightning rod for a lot of things that are wrong with Spotify in general, not just Joe Rogan, but the fact that people aren't being paid as much as they think they should be for artists, and the fact that Spotify has yet to follow through on their upgrade of their audio quality and a few other things. So people have, if they had a beef with Spotify, this has become something, it was picking at a scab. So it has become a real problem, a PR problem for Spotify, because yeah, it's the Joe Rogan thing, which is bad enough, but now people are following Neil and canceling their subscriptions.
Dean, Neil is known for being ethical, for having a conscience, for many decades now. But I've seen some of the comments under various videos from ordinary people who are listening and watching this debate, and some are saying, oh yes, the singer of Keep on Rocking in the Free World wants to shut down Joe Rogan's free speech. Do you think that Neil Young has a leg to stand on here, especially as he's moved a lot of his music on to, say, Amazon, which has a doubtful record on, should we say, labor rights for sure?
I think it's a question of looking at American values, many of which Neil Young stands for. And there are 3 core values that make America great, or historically have, and that's freedom, tolerance, and fairness. And I think in this situation, Spotify on 2 of those is right to do what it's done in some ways. The freedom of speech, the freedom of expression, the tolerance of other people's points of view. Rogan obviously loves and cherishes to get alternative points of view on his show. But where they've tripped up Rogan and Spotify is on fairness. Any entity that's spreading errors or lies that affects people's ability to process facts, especially if those opinions are unfounded and unscientific, doesn't meet the fairness quota. And that's where they've done something completely wrong. So really, Neil Young stands for those values and therefore subscribes to those values. So in a sense, this is the debate. What does Spotify need to be doing? And we're finding that the reason that he's raised this alarm is actually making change to their policies. We've had Rogan apologize. We've had him insist he won't do this again, that they'll be putting disclaimers on his podcasts. So change has been affected because of Neil Young's stance.
No, that's a good point. Alan, do you think this new misinformation warning they're planning to put on is enough to satisfy their critics?
Well, they have a stock market problem as well. Their stock has been down 25% so far this year. $4 billion has been wiped off their market cap recently. And today, Wednesday, February the 2nd, they have to release some financial results. So they have to be seen to be doing something for the stockholders and those who are taking a financial interest in the company. They have taken off 20,000 podcasts, they say. But the difference is that those podcasts are just being distributed by Spotify. Joe Rogan's podcast is a Spotify property. They paid him $100 million to distribute his podcast exclusively through Spotify. So while they're a distributor for all those other podcasts, they are a broadcaster of this particular podcast. Broadcasters fall under different rules. So they really do have to police what they're saying or what their product is saying, because there are additional legal complications.
Professor Schaffner, do you think that the new misinformation warning they're planning to put up is a step in the right direction?
It appears to be a small step in the right direction. Our late senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, famously said, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. I would love to have a discussion about public policy, your own opinion, but we have to agree on a set of facts. Otherwise, we can't have a coherent discussion about public policy and how we go forward.
Dr. Hinton, final question. We've seen where these warnings lead on Twitter. They start off as warnings, and then they delete your messages, and then they delete you. Are you concerned that Spotify is sort of heading in that direction?
Well, I certainly hope not. But as the good professor just talked about, we have to agree on facts. The problem is, in medicine and science, today's facts are disproved a few years later. And so we have to always keep an open mind. And often some of the best and the things that change the world the most come very much from left field, not from the mainstream. So we have to be open to discussion, which is why I think things like this program, bringing people together with different views, is so important.
Dr. Tony Hinton, Professor William Schaffner, Dean Crutchfield, and Alan Cross, thank you all for your contributions to The Nexus today. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.